Welcome back. We are continuing our segment with Bruce Croxon. And remember last time when he was here, we talked about Canada's government and the role it plays in the technology sector. Bruce is still with us. We also want to talk to somebody who's watching that segment and has a few thoughts as well. John Glowacki is the former Chief Operating Officer at Shares Services Canada and has worked with Canadian startups and the Government of Canada on a number of projects. Thank you, John, for joining us. So, Bruce, let's just go back. You brought up this issue around government IT contracts and who's ultimately getting those contracts. Why don't you revisit what you were talking about?
Yeah, my position was that if you look at the procurement process, it is heavily skewed against young Canadian companies from having a chance to grab government revenue. And increasingly we see, or we have seen and continue to see, the big meaty contracts going to companies like IBM, right, which are obviously not Canadian, although IBM Canada does exist. And I'm here to say, look, we have a tech sector that is swinging way above our weight. It would be extremely helpful in the overall picture if Canadian tech companies had a bona fide shot at landing some of these contracts. Exactly.
And John, you saw that segment, you were watching, you reached out to us to share your views. Right. What are your views on this subject?
So, first of all, I absolutely agree with the sentiment Bruce was making about we need to grow the tech sector and we swing above our weight. I would also say that there are some gaps in getting startups in government contracting and growing them. When I was at Shared Services Canada, we supported the Building Canada program. The problem is there's a gap, and once they graduate from that program, they now have to compete with Microsoft. And so we've got a dilemma there, a gap that has to be filled in the government. But as far as the big, contracts going to the big companies, there are certain times when, let's put it this way, Shared Services Canada was created because everybody was working with whatever company they wanted to. It cost more. It was a technical mess. And when you're in this business, and I come from, among other things, the large managed IT sector. Yeah. And that's a very small spectrum of the IT world. And you can't have, I basically push us toward you need experience. You can't have companies that have never moved 500 data centers to take that job on.
Is that the key issue that comes up when somebody at the end of the day has to make a decision on whether it's this fast-growing, homegrown company or one of these international technology companies, on who gets the larger contract?
It's less about, in this case, it's based on past performance. One of my mantras while I was there was we need to push more emphasis on contracts on past performance. When you look at the failures, and both from the government side of not always having the experience they should to manage these programs, and on the tech side of bringing companies in, even large companies, that did not have the experience for the job they had taken on. So when you look at some of these big contracts, and I know the one that was alluded to last week had to do with data center migration, you're talking about 500 data centers. You're talking about petabytes and thousands of servers. That's an immense job. You can't put it in the hands of people who have never done it before.
Well, I would counter by saying, listen, nobody's immune to mistakes. I'll reference the payroll system project that the government entered with IBM. Started out as a $5 million deal, ended up as a $200 million deal, and it's not yet done. So, and that's not a knock against IBM. I think the issue, times are changing, okay, first of all. I think the issue is more about the level of skill that is at the government level that is deciding where these contracts go. Because I'm here to tell you, and look at IBM, they've had 24, 25 consecutive quarters of revenue decline. There's a reason for that. People are moving away from large enterprise-based solutions to nimble, smarter, less expensive technology. But in order to make that shift, you need to have people that are smart enough in the buying seat, to understand where this is applicable and where this is not.
Well, this is an interesting point. I mean, John, do we have enough people in government who are as excited and joining the same way that they're joining the startups that companies like Bruce's are funding?
No, the government, like everybody else, is desperate for quality talent. And I would, just one quick point. Yeah. In the private sector of Canada, 1 in 4 people are paid by ADP. Okay, that's a big number. ADP does the payroll processing, so there is a place for the big companies. Again, it's the right tool for the right job. But if I can go back to the talent thing, I'm actually going to be publishing some articles, and one of them is about the way the government takes on system risk, which is something they shouldn't be doing. That was actually the large problem with the payroll. But the other part is getting qualified talent. Believe me, people in the government are working very hard, but you can't blame them for the experience they don't have.
Well, let me interject on the talent part, right? I mean, first of all, it is a bit surprising that the government can't get the talent. Best pension system in the Western world. I mean, and I'm telling my kids the best jobs in this country are government jobs. That is an aside and a bit of a sad commentary. But on the topic of talent, right? Explain to me why the government has a policy of supporting early stage tech, and they've done a great job, and they've opened up the immigration system and been very supportive at the early stage, while at the same time, and you came back on this point too, they've fallen all over themselves courting companies like Amazon and IBM and Google to open up big centers here that suck up our available talent. Those two things do not square to me.
I think if we want to be credible as a nation in the IT sector, we can't just be a nation of startups. You've got to have representation up and down the stack, and you've got to be able to say, startups want to be here, Amazon wants to be here. This is the place to be.
So we agree on that.
Yeah.
I think the method to be credible in this country is to take startups, make them medium-sized companies, and then make bigger companies out of them.
Yes.
I think the way not to do that is by courting companies like Amazon to suck up our best and brightest engineers rather than putting them to work in homegrown companies. And I think the way not to do that is to preclude early stage companies from bidding on government contracts. And I would use the example of our banks. Our banks are arguably the most conservative investor companies, whatever you want to call them, in the whole universe, right? There's no one more conservative than our banks. And look at the opportunities they are now giving to early fintech companies, where arguably the data is more critical than the data that the government's hosting.
Well,
they're getting out ahead of their skis in a way that I think is progressive. And I think that strategy is the one that's going to pay longer term dividends rather than courting people that are going to suck up our talent, A, and then B, shutting out companies because they don't have the perceived expertise to handle bigger contracts.
I think it's both. You actually need to be pursuing both. And by the way, Amazon in Ottawa is a distribution center. It's not HQ2, which would be
We've been trying for HQ2. We've been trying for HQ2. We want HQ2. Why do we want HQ2?
Which means this is a story that we're going to continue to watch, and a great story to keep talking about as we look where the next generation of jobs are going to come from. Thank you both for...
You're cutting us off, John. We're just getting started, man.
Great conversation. We'll have it again.
All right.
And we welcome everybody at home weighing in as well. Bruce Croxon joining us as always, and John Glowacki, formerly of Shared Services Canada, joining us. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about what's next for NAFTA. We're going to be joined by Canada's former ambassador to the U.S., Derek Burney. You're watching The Open on BNN Bloomberg.